So we're in your world history in chapter 26, the seventh section, and we're going to go over the Vietnam War, which happened in 1957 to 1975. And we'll be seeing how America got so entangled in this war and what the difference the Vietnam War was from World War I and World War II, and even different from the Korean War. So you see these pictures here is pretty horrific, some horrific pictures. You see our American soldiers there. You see the Vietnam refugees going on, and we're going to see a lot of these happenings. You see that the North Vietnamese with representing communism. So let's begin. Background of the conflict. So we have Indochina. As you see Indochina here, we'd have, this is Tonkin, this is actually, you go up here, you'll see North Vietnam and down to South Vietnam. This is Laos, Cambodia down here, and this is Thailand. So Indochina, when you think of Indochina, you think of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Well, in the late 1950s, Cold War of communism flared up to this conflict in Vietnam. Vietnam actually claimed the lives of over 58,000 American soldiers, American servicemen, and millions of Vietnamese and Laotians and Cambodians too. So a lot of lives lost. It began actually in 1930. The communist Vietnamese, his name, head of the communist Vietnamese, was named Ho Chi Minh. See right here? Ho Chi Minh. And he formed the Indochinese Communist Party to control all of Indochina. His goal was to control all of it for the communist purpose, and he being the dictator of it. So, in the midst of all this, after the Tehran Conference in World War II, President Roosevelt and Stalin agreed not to let the French control this area. France controlled most of Indochina here. And so they just decided not to help the French. And so this resulted in a war. They called it the Indochina War, which was in 1946 to 1954. Ho Chi Minh, remember, Ho Chi Minh is the communist North Vietnamese. He put together what he called the Viet Minh, after himself, the Viet Minh. And they defeated the French and the French Foreign Legion, and the French paratroopers came in and they defeated them. So the United States government rejected. France appealed for help, for air support to the United States, and we rejected that help that the French government wanted, which now we look back as might have been a good idea to help them. But Ho Chi Minh then had support from Communist China and the Soviet Union to defeat the French, basically getting France out of Indochina. The Geneva Accords of 1954. So the Viet Minh, remember Ho Chi Minh, the Viet Minh agreed to a temporary ceasefire, and Cambodia and Laos became independent states. So Vietnam then was partitioned along the 17th parallel, that latitude there, 17th parallel, into making it into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. So Ho Chi Minh continued as the dictator of North Vietnam. And Ngo Dinh Diem became the president of South Vietnam. Pretty important you know those names. Ho Chi Minh in the north and Diem in the south of South Vietnam. South Vietnam being a free nation, supported by the United States. So this is important. The 17th parallel, as we say, Ho Chi Minh governing from the north. The capital of North Vietnam is Hanoi. Pretty important you know that name. And the capital then of South Vietnam, which is no more, is Saigon. In 1956, they elected Diem, South Vietnam did, as their president there. So, and also, as we go on here, we'll find SEATO. So what's SEATO? SEATO is Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and it was formed by the United States and 7 other countries, so Asian and Pacific countries, in 1954. And the reason SEATO was, this is pretty important, this is really why we were so involved in Vietnam, because through SEATO we promised to aid the South Vietnamese if in event of further communist aggression and expansion. So basically saying if the communists came into South Vietnam, that we would help them, right? So SEATO is pretty important. So we had this agreement to help South Vietnam in the beginning. So here's SEATO, Collective Security, SEATO promising that aid. The fight for freedom of terrorism. Terrorism, communist terrorism. Communist terrorism was resumed in 1957. Ho Chi Minh was a terrorist, communist terrorist, just remember that. And he put together guerrillas. He called them guerrilla warfare. They would come out from the bushes and wherever and terrorize people. And he called them the Viet Cong. That's what you're going to hear in Vietnam. The Viet Cong are the North Vietnamese communist guerrilla terrorists. So we have the Viet Minh after Ho Chi Minh, but now we have the Viet Cong. And they were aided, the Viet Cong, these guerrillas, guerrilla warfare. When I say guerrillas, they're like fight like guerrillas, come out of the bushes, right? So they were aided by North Vietnamese troops and began a campaign of terrorism in the villages of South Vietnam. So what do communist countries do? They send in terrorists to get everything in confusion so that they can take over, as communists do, take over the country. So they began this terrorism in all these little villages of South Vietnam, the people. The village leaders then, they were tortured. Sometimes they were beheaded. They had their heads cut off. And they're disemboweled. Basically, their inside, their intestines and all, just cut out of them. That's really terrorism, isn't it? How horrific. Many of the Vietnamese Christians were tortured, of course. When the communists come in, the first they do is they terrorize Christians, and that Christians were tortured and murdered, and there would not be any Christian faith. They would not, the communist government of North Vietnam and on in, as they invaded South Vietnam, they were not going to allow any Christians at all. And many of them would not deny their faith, so they were tortured. In response, the American military aid began to flow into South Vietnam. As Americans saw what was going on in South Vietnam, we knew that they needed help. So our presidents, Eisenhower and President Kennedy, President Eisenhower was present at the beginning of this involvement, and now President Kennedy, being put into this era of the Vietnam War, dispatched hundreds of U.S. military advisors, they called them advisors, to help South Vietnamese, to help their military, to organize their military and bring in the weapons that they needed. The conflict widens. In 1960, Laos, the country next to Vietnam there, became the scene of communist aggression. Why? Because it's right on the border of Vietnam. The Viet Minh, remember, Ho Chi Minh, named the Viet Minh, North Vietnamese, staged a rebellion along the Laotian government line and fought a civil war with the government troops of Laos, or Laotian Laos. Cambodia was dragged into the war in the late 1960s when North Vietnam used the country as a base to attack South Vietnam. After 1963, United States military advisors were active in Laos along with troops from Thailand and South Vietnam. So the people of Laos, the people of Cambodia, the people of Thailand, they all disliked the North Vietnamese dictator Ho Chi Minh. Here's a picture of Ho Chi Minh here. This is kind of a drawing, but it looks just like him there. And then we have down here, here is the, look into this thing. I kind of look, I can't really zoom it in here, but here we have North Vietnam here with Hanoi up here in South Vietnam. And we have Cambodia and Laos, and you see this is the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So what they did, basically they did is they went through Laos and Cambodia, put this trail in so they could bring their army down here and attacked South Vietnam. This is called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to come down and use it as a military, to use it for war purposes. So in 1970, American and South Vietnamese invaded Cambodia to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That's the Ho Chi Minh Trail right here. So these, a route and supply trail to destroy the North Vietnamese supply depot. So basically the South Vietnamese realized what they were doing here and bringing this trail in so they could attack them, and so they would go on this trail to try to basically prevent them from doing this. Crucial years in 1963 and 1964. Who was president? President John F. Kennedy. So in 1963, weeks before his own assassination, President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and he gave secret approval to the CIA department scheme to encourage a group of South Vietnamese generals to depose President Diem and his brother. Oh my goodness. So what's happening here? So let's talk about, here's Diem. He's the president of South Vietnam. Well, in the midst of all this, he started persecution. He was both of them being Roman Catholic. He's Roman Catholic. He started a persecution of the Buddhists in the midst of this. Whether it happened or whether, communist subversion was coming into there, but he and his brother basically were becoming corrupted. And especially, I think it was his brother's wife but anyway, here we have a Buddhist priest that decided to protest, but in his protest, he burned himself alive, which is sickening. But America saw this and said, what is Diem doing? And President Kennedy thinking, what is Diem doing here? Now, the South Vietnamese people are going to be divided. And so he thought, we need to really get rid of Diem as being the president of South Vietnam. Well, so President Kennedy basically, as you can see here, it says the assassination of Diem, that he was assassinated by the CIA. It comes up before. Just recently did we find out this information, that he was assassinated by the CIA. On November 1st, Diem was captured and murdered. And the U.S. supported it, that he supported this. But JFK, the president, did not know this assassination was coming. He was in for the removal of him, but we don't know for sure if Kennedy was totally involved in all this. In the final analysis, it is their war. They're the ones who have to win it, is what Kennedy said. And so looking at Kennedy some people believe Kennedy was deep involved in this assassination, and others do not. But the really irony of this all, I should say, was that President Kennedy was assassinated 3 weeks after Diem. So Diem was assassinated, and our President Kennedy was assassinated too. And now we believe President Kennedy was assassinated by the CIA, possibly too. So what was going on with our department, our FBI and our CIA? Well, that's coming out too, that our government was going through a corruptive time, maybe possibly to get into the Vietnam War. Maybe possibly Kennedy did not want to get into the Vietnam War. I'm sure he didn't want to send more troops. But in the midst of this, this was a great turmoil to him, I'm sure. November 1st, 1963, these generals staged this coup and murdered Diem and his brother. As I said before, South Vietnam was plunged into political disorder now and very unstable. They didn't have their leader anymore. He was assassinated, even though he wasn't the best of leaders. This made South Vietnam appear to be an American puppet, that we were just controlling him. Now, Lyndon B. Johnson, after Kennedy was assassinated, who becomes president? Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson. And he said, this was the worst mistake we ever made in assassinating President Diem. So, this gets into craziness. In fact, the whole Vietnam War and all that went on is very, crazy and corrupt. And as a young girl, me listening and even having friends that were losing their older brothers, in this war as they were drafted into the war. It was crazy times in America too. The Gulf of Tonkin. What is this? Well, here we go. Here's South Vietnam, and here's North Vietnam, and the Gulf of Tonkin is right on North Vietnam, right here. And so here's our ships, allegedly. So after 1964, the United States became more involved with President Johnson. Remember, Kennedy was assassinated. On July 30th, 1964, 2 United States destroyers were allegedly fired upon by the North Vietnamese torpedoes and boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. The United States Naval and Air Force retaliated by sinking 2 of the North Vietnam's vessels and bombed the bases in North Vietnam. After a reported second attack, President Lyndon B. Johnson asked Congress for power to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent this further aggression. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was passed by the Congress, our Congress, on August of 1964 and provided legal justification for the United States military to be totally involved in Vietnam. Technically, though, it was not a war because the war was never declared. Oh, yes, but it was a war, wasn't it? Admiral James Stockade. This is so important. Now, it's coming out. This is all new, even newer than what's in your book. But Admiral James Stockade was an eyewitness and insisted that the entire incident was fabricated to give the United States president unconstitutional war-making powers. Bingo! Huh! This actually makes me sick. Sick at heart, because the Gulf of Tonkin was what brought us into the war, coming to find out that no, Admiral James was an eyewitness. He was in the Air Force that flew over them. He said there were no attacks, that basically there were no attacks on the military of the United States in the Gulf of Tonkin. The Vietnam did not attack them. And so it was all fabricated or made up so that the United States, the people of the United States would say, yes, let's get in this war. Look, they're attacking our ships. They've started it now. Now they're attacking us. Not just South Vietnam, but they're attacking us. The sickening part was that it didn't happen exactly. They had lied to make it look like we really needed to drastically jump into this war. Why? Well, one thing we know, at the times of war, certain people get very wealthy in the times of war. Not necessarily the ordinary citizens, but so who was really behind this whole thing? Well, we know Ho Chi Minh was a terrible, terrible dictator, and what happened, that South Vietnam was being attacked. We know all these things, but then in the midst of also we have the assassination of the president of South Vietnam and the president of the United States of America. And now we have the president coming in, Johnson coming in, and the country fabricating this so that the citizens, that we would see, man, okay, was this a Pearl Harbor? Did they remember how Japan attacked us in Pearl Harbor? Well, now did the Vietnam really attack our ships? We find out, no, they didn't. Full American involvement happened, though. On February 1945, President Johnson, I call him LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, ordered the American forces to bomb North Vietnam's installations. So he orders, here's Johnson here, sending our troops in, a lot of them being drafted young men, a little older than me. I'm seeing him being drafted. And March 6, 1965, the first American combat troops, the United States Marines, were sent to South Vietnam to protect the American bases there, so-called to protect us. In July, President Johnson ordered a general buildup of United States troops under the command of General William C. Westmoreland. So Westmoreland was going to be that general. In 1968, there were 50,000 soldiers in Southeast Asia of our soldiers. So here we have full American environment with, we see here, we see President Johnson here, we see this is Westmoreland, he was responsible, and we see our American troops now being fully involved in Vietnam. Now, remember we studied on Korea, North and South Korea, and how this was a no-win war. Why do we call it a no-win war? Because it was a war of containment. There was no way we can win, but just contain the present situation. This is not something, as a young person, if you turned 18 and you got drafted to go to the war, just to contain it and keep being a soldier of containment. No, you want to go in there and win the war, right? So in March 1967, General Westmoreland requested to invade Laos and Cambodia to disrupt the communist supply lines on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, right? And to increase allowable bombing targets in North Vietnam, and to expand the mining of North Vietnam. They put in these mines so that it would exploding mines of North Vietnam ports and to launch an amphibious invasion. An amphibious invasion means by ships into the ports. So he had a plan. General Westmoreland said, let's get going. But we're in a no-win war. As that time, Westmoreland didn't know we were, but that's just what we were in. But Secretary of Defense McNamara, now that picture of McNamara you saw with President Johnson, he opposed Westmoreland going in and bombing these targets, and he claimed that they posed an unacceptable risk of confrontation with the